In this video, I'm going to be discussing the perspective scaling option for Easy Team Builder. What perspective scaling does is it scales each row down as it goes back in order to make the image look more natural for what your eyes or camera would see. There are 7 different levels of perspective scaling, 1 through 7, and you can also turn it off by putting 0 in here. Now the default level is 2, and usually 2 gives you a pretty good look, and that's what we're looking at right here. If we go to 0, it's off. 7 is max, and that's pretty extreme. Usually you would only want to use 1, 2, or 3. That's what I recommend. But I did build in more extreme options for the cases where you want to use them. You might even want to adjust the number per row when you're going up that high too, but this just gives you the maximum flexibility having these other options. Now these numbers do not correlate to any specific percentage. Like for instance, the default level 2 is not a certain percentage, like it's not scaling down 2% each row. In fact, it doesn't even scale the same amount when it goes back per row. It's a non-linear adjustment. The math was all based on real world math for just for perspective to give the most natural look to what your eyes would see or the camera would see in a certain position with the player spaced back a certain amount. I'm not going to go over all the math, but it is very accurate to the real world. So just know that 1, 2, and 3 are probably your most common ones, and usually people will just stick with 2, which is the default, or turn it off. That would be the other option. Now a couple of things with this is you won't have perfect alignment in the gaps if you use perspective scaling. You see when this is off, like for instance player 9 or 11, 9, and 22, you can see those are they're lined up perfectly vertically. On the other side, 27, 14, and 53 are all lined up perfectly, and they're exactly halfway in between the players below them. Now if we go up, let's go all the way to 7, which is the most extreme. You can see they now angle back, and they also don't line up vertically with the players below them. And that's naturally what you would see if you had, or if you're using a really wide angle lens and getting closer, and you had a lot of perspective in your image. That's how it would look in your shot if you shot them all together. Now as you use a higher zoom and step back with your camera, that effect is going to be less. Let's go to like 4 here, for example. You can see they're angled back still. They still kind of line up in the gaps, but they're not perfectly centered. And 4, like I mentioned, is probably stronger than you would usually use anyway. When it's at the default of 2, they more or less line up in the center, but you can still see they angle some. And 2 gives you just enough of a step down in size from row to row to where it's not going to, the top row won't look too big, and your eyes don't see any effect to where you think there's too much perspective scaling. It just 2 seems to be the most natural look in my opinion, and that's why it's the default. So the last thing to mention is if you're using perspective scaling, it's important that when you run it, you select the proper number per row, and you don't want to be moving images around between rows because they won't be scaled correctly. So if I go all the way up to 7, just for the extreme example, if you built this and then all of a sudden decided that you wanted a player in the top to go on the bottom row, well, you can see that it's scaled down way too much. Now, if you only move them down 1 row, it might not be as bad. 2 rows is pretty noticeable, so just keep that in mind. Now, we're looking at it with 7, which is more than you would ever use. If you were using it at 2, you might not notice much at all, especially since the players in the back are the taller ones by default. So if you put him in the front row, He's actually still taller than one of the shortest players. But if you look at the numbers, you can see 22 is, the numbers are much shorter than the 35 here or the 27. So you can tell by the numbers that he scaled down too much, but we're putting one of the taller players into the front row. So they should be considerably taller. So just keep that in mind, that if you move them around per row, the scaling is going to be off. Even if you only go one row, it's going to be off a little bit. So you may, if you do that, you may need to manually scale your images. But just try to get them right when you build, so you don't have that effect. And of course, you could move around within row, and that's not going to mess up your scaling at all because it's within the same row, so they are scaled the same as the players next to them. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. It's really pretty basic. And like I said, most of the time, just use 2. Unless you want to turn it off, then use 0. And you just type in the number you want. Unless you need to use something different for a particular build. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you learned something.